title for my sermon today is Desperate Housewives. What does that picture in your mind? And I don't mean the TV show. We're just not going there. What is it that makes a person desperate? Usually, there's circumstances that are not being met, and it's something that they really need. A desperate person is somebody who needs something or maybe someone. Today we're taking a snapshot in the lives of two women who were in need. How would you feel if you opened up the door and there outside was Jesus and his disciples as well? Would you invite them to dinner like Martha did? Would you worry about the threadbare couch or the dog hair on the pillows, that lived-in look of your home, that stuff scattered about? Would that bother you and make you a little bit anxious? Martha and Mary were real women. They were not just parables or illustrations. They lived with their brother Lazarus in Bethany, which is a small village not far from Jerusalem. You approached Jerusalem via the Mount of Olives to go to Bethany. We read of Martha and Mary on only 3 occasions in the Bible, and on each occasion it reveals a different facet of their character. We're first introduced to the sisters in the book of Luke. Jesus and his disciples had just come across from Capernaum to Judea. So I'd like you to turn to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10 and verse 38. Verse 38 of Luke chapter 10. As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a village where a woman named Martha welcomed them into her home. So Martha was right up there. She welcomed Jesus into her home, and she's portrayed as the perfect hostess. Now, she was probably the older sister because every time the 3 siblings are mentioned, Martha is mentioned first, and normally they would list the older person first. Now, we're not told whether Jesus actually knew these people before this visit, but he may have already been acquainted with the family because there seems to be some sort of familiarity between Martha and Jesus. Welcoming Jesus and this entourage implied the fullest form of hospitality and generosity. Quite a large group appeared on the doorstep, and Martha was out there to welcome them into her home. True hospitality is a gift. It doesn't matter if the house is not pristine. True hospitality wraps a person up in a grace hug and makes them feel special. Forget about the dust bunnies and the random socks lurking under the well-worn couch. Hospitality is something that you and I can always do. We can open our hearts and our homes to that family next door with the noisy dog. We may cement a new friendship. We might laugh about some dust and enjoy a little grace together. But let's continue with the story. Let's go on with verse 39. Verse 39, her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he taught. Now Martha had a sister called Mary, it tells us. Now Mary also, some of the versions of the Bible say that Mary also sat at the feet of Jesus. Now that made me wonder, was Martha there as well? Perhaps she was. It was not the custom for women to join the men in the discussion, but I like to think that both of these girls sat down and listened to the discussion. It was Mary's natural instinct to sit down and listen to Jesus, but perhaps they both listened. Perhaps they both listened for a while and joined in the discussion, and no doubt there were questions and answers that were enlightening and thought-provoking. I think both Martha and Mary needed to hear what Jesus had to tell them. Jesus encouraged women to learn, treating them as equals in a male-dominated society. And I believe this was the reason for his visit. He came to that household to teach. He wanted to teach this family all about himself. No doubt the friends became hungry. No doubt the disciples were a bit peckish. And it was Martha, the caring hostess, who busied herself to provide food for the guests. She wanted to provide the best she had. So now we find Martha scurrying around her kitchen, organising food. Martha has become distracted. She has stopped listening to Jesus. And here lies the problem. Mary's out in the sitting room with the men, while Martha is flying about trying to prepare a meal for 15 plus visitors, all by herself. She's probably feeling a little frustrated and needs some help. Perhaps she dropped a hint, perhaps she banged some pots, perhaps she made some noises in the kitchen. But Mary didn't get the message. Who amongst us would not want help when a number of unexpected guests arrived? Surely she was justified in asking for Mary's assistance. But that is where discontent begins. Martha compared her situation to somebody else's and realised she had the short straw. Don't we get caught in this same trap sometimes? I look at somebody's life, their lovely smiles on the social media. She has a nicer house than mine and she goes on better holidays than I do. Discontent perches on my shoulder. Comparison is a trickster. He never tells the full story. We catch only a snapshot of the other person's life. It's just like the smiling Christmas photograph. It doesn't tell about the pre-pose argument or the screaming toddler just after the shot was taken. We don't get the whole story. The truth is, God works in every story. No two stories are exactly the same. Comparison does not change her story, and it does not change your story. It just steals your joy. So let's go back to our story now and read verse 40. But Martha was worrying over the big dinner that she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, "Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me." Martha took her frustration with her and spoke her mind in front of all her guests. Martha went straight to Jesus, "Send Mary to help me." And Jesus' gentle answer in verse 41 is much the same as a parent speaking to their child. Don't fuss over these details, Martha. Jesus didn't chastise Martha for being rude to Mary or being overly preoccupied with preparing a meal. He just said, "Don't be upset, Martha." There are some things more important than making a good impression. Set your priorities, Jesus really said. Serving is good, but sitting at Jesus' feet is better. Do we spend hours in preparation for a special meal because someone is coming for Sabbath lunch and miss our devotions that day? Do we have a perfectly clean, spotless home instead of spending quality time with our children? Was Martha dangerously busy? The conversation that evening was eternal. The calories were not. Don't be so busy doing things for Jesus that you don't get to spend time with him. Jesus continues his conversation in verse 42. In verse 42 it reads, "There is really only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and I won't take it away from her." Mary has discovered what is important, and I shall not take it away from her. The spiritual knowledge we accumulate in this life will not be taken from us. We get to keep the good part. Mary was so consumed by Jesus' words that she probably didn't notice anything else. She understood the importance of this occasion. The Son of God was a guest in her home. Listening to Jesus and worshipping him was the best place she could focus her energies. Jesus gently reminded Martha what she needed to be concerned with and where to focus. Luke's story ends here, so we can conclude that the message went straight to Martha's heart. Serving is good, but sitting at the feet of Jesus is better. We must focus on our relationship with him. What in our lives have we chosen that is good, lasting and eternal? Have we separated the trivial from the important? Do we understand the difference between nice to know, want to know, and need to know? Is the good part, the important part, visible in our lives? Or are we still running around desperately doing when we should be sitting at Jesus' feet? Don't be so busy doing things for Jesus that you don't get time to spend with him. When we next hear of Martha and Mary, they're facing a crisis. Their brother Lazarus is ill. The sisters sent word to Jesus when Lazarus became ill. They were more than desperate now. They didn't want their brother to die, but where was Jesus? The last few verses of chapter 10 of John, we'll turn to John chapter 11, but in the last few verses of chapter 10, it tells us where Jesus is. It tells us that it appears that he was trying to get a little bit of time out somewhere beyond the Jordan River where John was first baptising, but Jesus never got to get time out because people always followed him. So we'll take up this next story, John 11, verse 1 to 7. John chapter 11 and verses 1 to 7. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick, so the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, the one you love is sick. When Jesus heard about this, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it is for the glory of God that I, the Son of God, will receive glory from this. Although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days and did not go to them. Finally, after 2 days, he said to his disciples, Let's go to Judea again. Was this the sort of behaviour that you would expect from a close friend? Wouldn't you think a friend would rush straight away? But no, Jesus delayed for 2 days. He didn't go to their aid. If he'd gone earlier, perhaps he would have saved Lazarus. Perhaps he would have healed him. But he didn't go. Was he afraid to go back to Judea because the leaders might kill him? We'll pick up the story again on verse 8 to 11. But his disciples objected. Teacher, they said, only a few days ago the Jewish leaders in Judea were trying to kill you, and now you are going there again. Jesus said to them, Jesus replied, there are 12 hours of daylight every day. As long as it is light and people can walk safely, they can see because they have the light of the world. Only at night is there danger of stumbling because there is no light. Then he said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep? The disciples thought this was good news and that he was going to be getting better. But Jesus plainly said to them, Lazarus is dead. Then he said something rather confusing in verse 14, I'm glad I wasn't there, as this will give you another opportunity to believe in me. What did he mean by this? This statement was to become much clearer later on. It appears that the disciples thought it was a dangerous mission to return to Judea because in verse 16, Thomas said, let's go too and die with him. So it appears that they thought that they would all be in trouble if they went back to Judea. In verse 17, we pick up the story again where Martha and Mary come into the picture again. Verse 17, when Jesus arrived in Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Bethany is only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to pay their respects and console Martha and Mary on their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. So when Jesus got near to the village, Martha went out to meet him. And it shows the difference between the two sisters again, because Martha goes out to meet Jesus when she knows he's in the area, but Mary stayed at home. They'd handled their grief in a different manner. So Martha goes to Jesus, quite grief-stricken, and she just says what's on her mind. Verse 21. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." "Yes," said Martha, "when everyone else rises on the resurrection day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die like everyone else, will live again. They are given eternal life for believing in me and will never perish. Do you believe this, Martha?" "Yes, Lord," she told him, "I've always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God." So as she talks with Jesus, Martha goes on to express her faith in him, and Martha shows that she believes in the resurrection and that she believes Jesus is the Messiah. This is just the response that Jesus wants from all of us. Her faith is well placed, for she cannot know what's about to happen. In verse 28, then she left him and returned to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, "The teacher is here and wants to see you." So Mary went to him. Now Jesus stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house trying to console Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed that she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep, so they followed her. And when Mary met up with Jesus, she said exactly the same thing, didn't she? "If you'd be here, Lord, Lazarus would not have died." But she handled it quite differently because she fell at his feet and she cried. So these two sisters have different personalities, but yet they both show their faith in the Lord. When Jesus saw the display of grief among the family and the mourners, he was intensely moved and greatly distressed, and he wept openly. Perhaps he empathised with their grief, or perhaps he was troubled by the unbelief of some of them. Whichever the case, Jesus shows that he cares enough to weep with us in our sorrow. John shows us that we have a God who cares. He describes Jesus' compassion, indignation, sorrow, and even frustration in his gospel. This contrasts sharply with the Greek concept that was popular at the time, for the Greek portrayed a God with no emotions and no messy involvement with humans. We can know that Jesus understands our emotions because he experienced them. We'll continue on with verse 34. "Where have you put him?" he asked them. They told him, "Lord, come and see." Then Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said how much he loved him, but some said, "This man healed the blind man. Why couldn't he keep Lazarus from dying?" And Jesus was deeply troubled when they came to the grave. It was a cave with a stone roll across it. And he said, "Roll aside the stone." Now the mourners were quite confused also. They said, "This man healed a blind man. Why couldn't he heal Lazarus?" But again, nobody was aware of what was about to unfold. Tombs in those days were usually caves carved in the hillside, usually limestone rock. and they're often large enough to walk around in and accommodate several bodies. A large stone was usually rolled across the entrance to close off the tomb. When Jesus asked for the stone to be rolled away, the ever-practical Martha reminded Jesus that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. We'll look again now at verse 40. Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that you will see God's glory if you believe?" So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of these people standing here, so they will believe you sent me." Then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus came out, bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." My Bible translation says that he shouted, and others say that he spoke, but I believe he would have spoken rather loudly because he would have wanted everybody around to hear what he was saying. He would have wanted them to hear that he commanded that Lazarus be released from death. He would have wanted everybody to know what he was doing. We can only imagine the astonishment of the mourners and the joy, the absolute joy of Martha and Mary as they saw Lazarus emerge. Then go to verse 45. Verse 45 reads, "Many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happen." And I believe this is the key verse to the whole story. Many people believed. Jesus loved this family. They had become true friends. He knew their pain. So why didn't he respond immediately to their call? His delay had a specific purpose. Everything Jesus did was planned. Nothing was a coincidence. God's timing, especially his delays, makes us think he is not answering. But he will meet our needs according to his perfect schedule. Patiently await his timing. Lazarus died so Jesus' power over death could be shown to his disciples and those around about. Remember back in verse 14, Jesus told them something rather confusing. He said he was glad that he wasn't there when Lazarus died because this would give them another opportunity to believe in him. And now we see why he made this statement. He had a purpose in allowing Lazarus to die. The raising of Lazarus was an essential display of Jesus' power over death. The resurrection of the dead is a crucial belief of the Christian faith. The believer has the wonderful assurance that they will live again. We next meet the sisters in John 12, verse 1. Apparently, Jesus was quite comfortable in this home because we find that he's here again at Passover, which is the last week of his life. So we'll turn to John 12, chapter 1. And I like the way the Common English Bible presents this scene. 6 days before the Passover ceremony began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he'd raised from the dead. Lazarus and his sisters hosted a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was amongst those who joined him at the table. So here was the family serving Jesus. They had much to be thankful for. Martha was hostess, and this time no conversation is recorded. Lazarus joined Jesus at the table, and Mary? We'll turn to verse 3 and see what Mary was doing. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made of essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with fragrance. Well, Mary did something quite different. She took a large amount of perfume and anointed Jesus' feet. It was a quiet act, but not something she could hide, because beautiful perfume permeated the room and probably wafted right out down the street. Mary was so convicted and dedicated to Jesus that no expense or personal act was too great or demanding for her to honour her Saviour. We read verse 4 to 8 and see the reaction of the others. But Judas Iscariot, verse 4, one of the disciples, the one who would betray him, said, "That perfume was worth a small fortune. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor." Not that he cared for the poor. He was a thief who was in charge of the disciples' funds and often took some for his own use. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She did it in preparation for my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but I will not be here with you much longer." So Mary looked after Jesus' comfort and was criticised. Some translations say that she was scolded. But Jesus knew her motives. Jesus also knew Judas's character. When Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet back in Luke's Gospel, she learned about him. She seemed to be able to discern Jesus' true purpose, perhaps even better than his disciples. Even on the night of his betrayal, the disciples ignored the basic rule of hospitality rather than take the servant's role and wash the others' feet. Her act of anointing him shows remarkable understanding of Jesus' purpose. Her faith in and love for Jesus was displayed by her actions. These women showed their practical side and their spiritual side. Jesus helped them to bring things into balance. They both loved and served him in different ways. They moved from desperation to adoration. They found who was missing from their lives. Perhaps we are not so different from the early Martha, desperately busy, trying to do it all, building resentment. Do we let the dishes sit for a while? Do we leave the dust bunnies and the random socks right where they are under the couch while we first spend time with Jesus? Nothing is wrong with being practical and efficient if it doesn't interfere with the more important things of life. Our daily choices affect our lives. The end result of this life is determined by the choices we make every day. We need to spend time each day worshipping the Lord and focusing on the good part. Jesus asks us to put things into perspective and put him first. Then we will not be desperately busy, but adoring, confident, loving followers of Jesus. Jesus had a purpose. He deliberately touched the lives of this family that they and many others might come to believe in him. His purpose was to show them that he is the Messiah. Jesus has a purpose. He deliberately wants to touch your life. He wants to touch your life deliberately. He wants you to know that he is the Messiah. We'll now have our final hymn. Hymn number 524, "'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus." 524.